Nietzsche tries to argue that Christianity was basically corrupted by Paul, and that there was one true Christian who died on the cross, namely Jesus himself. Some of these remarks about, the law and Jesus being here to affirm the Jewish law, and Jesus being, an heir to the Jewish prophets, and especially, Nietzsche says, Jesus's remarks about the coming judgment and about how he will return, and all the peoples of the world will be judged by God and by the apostles and so on and so forth, that these are later interpolations, that the Christianity that took shape in the wake of Paul basically tampered with the text of the Gospels and put these words in the mouth of Jesus. Well, there's really no evidence for that. I don't know on what basis Nietzsche thinks that he's making any kind of sound, as he puts it, philological argument here. Okay, when you actually look at the Gospels, the text of the Gospels, not only is all this stuff about the apocalypse in there and about the judgment and threats of burning in hellfire if you don't follow Jesus and all that, but it's very clear when you read the text of the Gospels that a kind of cognitive dissonance is being set up, where on the one hand, you have Jesus affirming all of the most draconian edicts of the Old Testament and clearly aligning himself with the Jewish prophets and the law that they brought on behalf of Yahweh, and repeatedly saying that he is the son of Yahweh and he's in the world on behalf of Yahweh on the one hand. And on the other hand, in for example, the Sermon on the Mount, you have Jesus deliver this teaching which point for point appears to contradict fundamental tenets of the Old Testament, right? Like, for example, turning the other cheek, never engaging in any kind of retributive justice, any kind of vengeance, not only not retaliating, but even forgiving anyone for anything they might possibly do, not only forgiving a person, but refusing to even judge a person in the first place, right? And by the way, while I'm on that, what kind of an ethos is that? And should that be put into effect in society, right? In its authentic form? I mean, what kind of a world would we be left with, right? If there were no judgment at all, that you couldn't prosecute anybody, and as Jesus himself says, you shouldn't even resist evil, right? Or if someone steals from you, you should just give him whatever else you also have left. What society would that leave us with? And this, I think, is where Nietzsche is right in the Antichrist, to criticize Jesus as a kind, or at least to criticize Christianity as a kind of anarchism, as a kind of destructive anarchism, a nihilistic anarchism. All right, but to go back to my point, you have on the one hand all these law-affirming, Torah-affirming statements unequivocally made by Jesus in, at least several of the Gospels. And then on the other hand, you have this teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, and then some somewhat Gnostic-sounding remarks, particularly from the Gospel of John. And what this does is it sets up a polarity of contradictory beliefs and statements, which basically inculcate a state of cognitive dissonance, right? And this is a technique that's well understood by psychologists and people who particularly are experts in psychological operations, where when you force someone to simultaneously accept contradictory beliefs as true, you're destroying their reasoning capacity and forcing them to accept things on blind faith. In other words, to unquestioningly accept your authority. And this is used in particular in situations that we call situations of Stockholm syndrome, okay? Like situations of hostage taking or of domestic abuse, where a hostage taker or an abuser tries to get the person who's captive to see them actually as their savior or liberator. So that the captivator forces the captive into accepting him and seeing him as his liberator. And cognitive dissonance is a technique that's used in order to bring this about. To my mind, that's what we see going on in the Gospels. That's why, Jesus's statements, that's why his prophetic mission was engineered in the way that it was, ultimately to destroy the reasoning capacity of the society that was subjected to it, which was ultimately the society of the Roman Empire. And here I think Nietzsche is absolutely on point in the Antichrist, where he analyzes the degenerative effect of Christianity, particularly on the scientific and intellectual establishment of, Rome, and particularly the culture of Alexandria that flourished in the Hellenistic period of the Roman Empire, where there's this just amazing passage, which I don't know if you want to take a time out for a minute, we can even read it from the Antichrist, where he's lamenting basically the destruction of Alexandrian high culture by the Christians. And you can see in that passage very clearly the Antichrist as the champion of science and as the bringer of enlightenment to mankind, by comparison to the will to enforce ignorance that we see being implemented through the machinery of the church.
Jason, you tell me if this is correct, by the way. So it's number 47. It starts off, the thing that sets us apart is not that we are unable to find God, either in history or in nature, or behind nature, but that we regard what has been honored as God, not as divine, but as pitiful, as absurd, as injurious, not as a mere error, not as a mere mistake, but as a crime against life. We deny that God is God. If anyone were to show us this Christian God, we'd be still less inclined to believe in him. In a formula, Deus qualem palus crevat de negatio. Such a religion as Christianity, which does not touch reality at a single point, which goes to pieces the moment reality asserts its right at any point, inevitably be the deadly enemy of wisdom of this world, which is to say of science. And it will give the name of good to whatever means serves to poison, calumniate, and cry down all intellectual discipline, all lucidity and strictness in matters of intellectual conscience, and all noble coolness and freedom of the mind. Faith as an imperative vitus of science, in praxis, lying at any price. St. Paul well knew that faith was necessary. Later on, the church borrowed the fact from Paul, that God and Paul invented for himself a God who reduced to absurdity the wisdom of the world, that is, science, especially the two great enemies of superstition, philology and medicine, is, in truth, only an indication of Paul's resolute determination to accomplish that very thing himself, to give one's own will to the name of God. That is essentially Jewish. Paul wants to dispose of the wisdom of this world. His enemies are the good philologist physicians of the Alexandrian school. On them he makes his war. As a matter of fact, no man can be a philologian or a physician without being also an antichrist. That is to say, a man of science sees behind the holy books, and as a physician, he sees behind the physiological denigration of the typical Christian. The physician says incurable, the philologian, I can't pronounce that, says fraud. Yeah, that's an absolutely brutal take. My God.
Yeah.
That is the part of Antichrist I was thinking of, but it gets even better in 48, which is the next one. So let me read on slightly. Trust me, it'll be worth it. Okay, so this is the following passage. Has anyone ever clearly understood the celebrated story at the beginning of the Bible of God's mortal terror of science? No one, in fact, has understood it. This priest book par excellence opens, as is fitting, with the great inner difficulty of the priest. He faces only one great danger. Ergo, God faces only one great danger. Skipping ahead a little bit in this take he has on the Garden of Eden. Woman at bottom is a serpent. Heva, Eve. Every priest knows that. From woman comes every evil in the world. Every priest knows that too. Ergo, she is also to blame for science. It was through woman that man learned to taste of the tree of knowledge. What happened? The old God was seized by mortal terror. Man himself had been his greatest blunder. He had created a rival to himself. Science makes men godlike. It is all up with priests and gods when man becomes scientific. Moral science is the forbidden per se. It alone is forbidden. Science is the first of sins, the germ of all sins, the original sin. This is all there is of morality. Thou shalt not know. The rest follows from that. God's mortal terror, however, did not hinder him from being shrewd. How is one to protect oneself against science? For a long while, this was the capital problem. Answer, out of paradise with man, happiness, leisure, foster thought, and all thoughts are bad thoughts. Man must not think, and so the priest invents distress, death, the mortal dangers of childbirth, all sorts of misery, old age, decrepitude, above all sickness, nothing but devices for making war on science. The troubles of man don't allow him to think. Nevertheless, how horrible. The edifice of knowledge begins to tower aloft, invading heaven, shadowing the gods. What is to be done? The old God invents war. He separates the peoples. He makes men destroy one another. War, among other things, a great disturber of science. Incredible! Knowledge, deliverance from the priests, prospers in spite of war. So the old God comes to his final resolution. Man has become scientific. There is no help for it. He must be drowned. Referring to the flood of Noah, of course.
The second passage, number 48, that Jason just read, I actually know very well. It's one of Nietzsche's most brilliant passages, and it's one of those ones where he's just hilarious in it. You know, you're listening to him, it's like, this dude is just so sharp. You know, he's everything that the new atheists wish they were, type thing. And the motif of this, the sort of idea that's going in this passage is that it's like the Wizard of Oz. You know, you go in and you meet the big Wizard of Oz, and you go behind the curtain, and it's just this little guy who's like blowing up this big avatar to scare people. And it's very much like this. The whole story, when you like inspect the Bible, it's suspiciously suitable to what a priestly type would want, which is this accusation of woman, this anti-knowledge attitude. Because of course, if you become scientific, you start asking questions about these men in robes and being like, "What do you mean I have to run around my house in circles or pray this or pray that in order to heal myself? Why can't I just use this antibiotic or something like this?" There's all that sort of sentiment inside of it that's very, very important. And I think that was building up as an enormous emotional and psychological position, especially in Nietzsche's time. Like, he sort of got ahead of it, but it was building up since the Enlightenment. You read Voltaire and you see all that sentiment where the priestly type who own the control system of Christianity are a scam, and we shouldn't be paying attention to them. They are anti-knowledge. They want to keep us asleep, basically. And this is not doing us any favors. They are the herdsmen of a herd that keep us away from knowledge, truth, beauty, even in some extent. And Nietzsche becomes one of the rehabilitators of this perspective, and he sort of perfects it in some sense. He sees himself very much as like completing the Enlightenment project. He talks about this an awful lot in Beyond Good and Evil, that the Enlightenment broke us free from many of the delusions of the previous 1,000 years. And Christianity was a big one. But the problem is that the Enlightenment never achieved the full blossoming, which was to actually revolutionize morality. Instead, most of the Enlightenment thinkers were Christian moralists, just without the Christianity, very much like what you see the new atheists are like, which is so interesting that he psychologically categorized these people. And Nietzsche comes and he tries to just push it the next step forward, to have the reevaluation of morality, to have like the really next step, like to actually finish the project of the European Enlightenment. There's a guy called Kalergi, who's very famous for some reasons. And he says a very interesting quote where he says, the only heathen thinker, pagan thinker of the last 2,000 years in Europe was Nietzsche. All the rest of them are Christians, because they're all the rest of them are Judaic, actually, is what he says, because they're stuck within the Judaic Weltanschauung, if you want to put it this way. And like, that's quite strong. But, you know, like the Judeo-Christian perspective, if you want to think about this, or Plato's perspective, maybe. What's so fascinating about Jordan Peterson is that our age, in general, what is so fascinating about it is how almost shabby an awful lot of our intellectual sphere is. Because in some sense, the new atheists are like the Enlightenment Voltaire, showing up again as like a mimetic echo. You know, they show up and they're like celebrating, we need more well-being, and Christianity won't bring us towards well-being. And then Jordan Peterson comes essentially as a reaction against that, because that's not a very strong position. And Jordan Peterson comes and he presents this sort of evolutionary psychology grounded way of understanding Christianity, as Christianity is based, and it's going with this more reactionary conservative perspective. And the woke movement does them no favors either. So he ends up peddling off this an awful lot. This is not correct per se, but it's almost like he's fighting a straw man. You know, he's fighting a very weak version of what was going on. And Nietzsche blazed that whole project forward. Like he was like, these two guys are bickering in a dialectic, the new atheists and Peterson, and Nietzsche was like the next paradigm up. Like, he's beyond the two of them completely. And I've always loved Jordan Peterson, and I've always liked his stuff, but he's never really addressed Nietzsche properly at all. He dismisses him very, very, I would nearly say intellectually suspiciously, by saying stuff like, oh, Jung just said he's wrong. You know, like, he says such crazy stuff as, Nietzsche said you can create your own values, and Jung said that's wrong. And it's like, first of all, Nietzsche said you should reevaluate your own values. values, and you will have the possibility of creating them if you're a certain type of person. Like there's all these weird things he does with it. So he just sort of throws this out, and he's going around, he's talking about God is dead, and he's talking about all these Nietzschean concepts, but never actually utilizing the man himself. So I think he hasn't even reached the big questions, and for that reason, I think I don't notice many people talking about him anymore at all. Like, I personally have just turned away from him, not out of like hate or anything like this, but I just find him uninteresting. Like, Jason has much more interesting ideas than Jordan Peterson does, and he really makes you expand your thinking. Jordan kind of like he's a conservative in his true nature, and he's trying to get a slightly more based version of the Enlightenment now Steven Pinker type character. He's trying to like build up that corner, and I think there's value in that, because there's a lot of like people who are sort of middle of the run, straight people, and these are good people that hold society together. And Jordan talks very sensibly, and he gives them a respectable position to stand and not tolerate an awful lot of crap. Because Jordan's very good at turning around and being like, here, like, protect my freedom, protect my rights. So I like that type of stuff with him. But in terms of like intellectual sophistication, I don't think there's anything interesting coming out of him, unfortunately. He hasn't busted any paradigms. This is very maybe arrogant for me to say, but I just don't think it's really covered anything. And I think we're all still in the shadow of someone like Friedrich Nietzsche, and unfortunately it's going to remain that way until his ideas are wrestled with, and we're discussing the kind of hard stuff.